To my grandchildren, remember this: sometimes the thing that almost kills you becomes the reason you live deeper than ever before. I never thought the quiet paths of Yellowstone would test the limits of how much pain and wonder a single human heart can hold. You won't believe how this story ends. It might break even the hardest, stone-hearted soul, because the moment I thought I'd taken my last breath turned out to be only the beginning of something I still can't explain. The day started so serene, it felt almost sacred, as though the whole park was inhaling in one long, silent breath. Early sun filtered through steam rising off the thermal pools, painting everything in pale gold and silver, and the cold air smelled of pine and damp soil. My hiking poles clicked rhythmically against the trail, each step echoing softly in the hush of dawn, while a woodpecker hammered somewhere deep among the lodgepole pines. At 73 years old, I took pride in knowing these trails better than some rangers did, and I'd chosen the thoroughfare region for its wild emptiness and raw beauty. There were no crowds here, just me and the sprawling solitude, a place where you could almost hear time moving. I remember thinking my biggest problem would be whether my knees could handle another day of steep climbs. In my pack I carried water, jerky, and a battered leather journal where I wrote tiny notes about wildflowers and tracks I found. That morning I felt utterly safe, a foolish certainty I now look back on with bitter respect for how wrong I was. Even the squirrels seemed calm, rustling pine needles as they scurried away, oblivious to the storm about to come crashing through my world. And somewhere behind that gentle stillness, an invisible presence was already watching. As the sun climbed higher, the breeze turned crisp and kept the mosquitoes at bay, and I paused near a small clearing to sip water and jot down some notes about a cluster of bear grass blooming in perfect white spheres. I thought I heard something crunch lightly beyond the tree line, but told myself it was just an elk moving through the brush, nothing unusual in this part of Yellowstone. Birds sang on either side of the trail, and a chipmunk darted across my boot, making me laugh under my breath at how skittish life seemed in these woods. I remember running my fingers over the bark of a giant pine, feeling the sap sticky against my skin, marveling at the scent like sun-warmed resin. I was leaning on my pole, deciding whether to keep going or turn back for camp, when the wind shifted and carried a scent sharp and musky that I couldn't immediately place. It was primal, deep, almost sweet but wrong somehow, like wet fur mixed with earth and something metallic. For a split second my pulse stumbled, a primitive voice in my chest whispering danger, though my mind refused to admit it. I tried to laugh it off, but my hand stayed close to the bear spray clipped to my belt, and then silence fell like a dropped curtain, leaving only my own breathing in the suddenly frozen air. Moments later I began noticing little signs I should never have ignored, though they seemed harmless at first. A patch of overturned soil clawed up in ragged streaks, as if something massive had dug for roots or grubs in a frenzied search for food. Fresh bear tracks the size of dinner plates, toes splayed, the claws leaving deep punctures in the dirt where the ground was still soft from snowmelt. A branch snapped sharply somewhere off to my left, louder than any elk could have made it, and the bird stopped singing all at once. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the summer heat, and I kept spinning around, scanning between tree trunks for movement. I told myself over and over that grizzlies usually wanted nothing to do with humans, that if I stayed calm and made noise, it would move away. But the forest felt different that morning, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could sense eyes on me, a weight pressing down even though I saw nothing but shifting shadows. My heart began beating so hard, it made my chest hurt, thudding like a warning drum. I started talking out loud, reciting my name and where I was from, my voice trembling as I tried to sound bigger than I felt. And still, the silence seemed to lean closer, listening. I continued along the trail, moving slower now, every footstep placed with caution, though my legs wanted to sprint back toward camp. Shafts of sunlight cut through the trees in jagged stripes, and floating motes of dust glittered like gold dust swirling in the air. I glanced back every few yards, half expecting to see fur sliding between the tree trunks, but all I saw was the shifting green darkness. My breath came in short bursts, and sweat trickled down my temples despite the cool breeze. I kept replaying news articles I'd read about bear encounters in Yellowstone, how quickly things turned from calm to chaos. My hand never left the bear spray, thumb trembling on the safety clip. A chickadee landed on a branch above my head, scolding me with sharp chirps, and for a moment I thought maybe I was overreacting. But that smell was still there, drifting in and out like a faint warning, growing stronger as I rounded a bend. A rustle came from the brush beside the path, deeper and slower than any small animal would make, and when I stopped walking and strained my ears, I heard the low, rhythmic huff of powerful lungs. The last thing I remember before my world split open was locking eyes with a shape emerging from the shadows, a mountain of muscle and fur, stepping silently onto the trail. It was a grizzly bear, taller than my shoulders, even on all fours. Its shoulders humped and massive, fur shining with hints of gold where the sun struck it. Its face looked almost thoughtful, dark eyes fixed on me, the wet black nose quivering as it tested my scent in the breeze. My vision tunneled, as if my body knew before my mind that the distance between us was shrinking far too quickly. The bear lowered its head and flattened its ears, shifting its weight forward in a slow, deliberate motion. My lungs seized up and my legs felt filled with ice, refusing to obey even as my instincts screamed at me to back away. A deep, coughing grunt rumbled from the bear's chest, vibrating through the ground into the soles of my boots. I remember thinking how unreal it was to be so close to something so alive, so absolutely built for killing. And then, without warning, it lunged. The sound the bear made as it lunged was something I'd never heard from any living creature. A guttural roar, half snarl, half thunder, like the forest itself was tearing apart. It covered the ground between us with terrifying speed, its claws spraying pine needles and dirt in an arc around its massive paws. I raised my hiking poles out of instinct, thrusting them toward its face, but they might as well have been twigs. The bear swatted them aside with a single swipe so powerful I felt the vibration shoot up my arms and into my shoulders. My bear spray was in my hand, but I couldn't even flip the safety off in time before it was on me. Its eyes were black and wet, not angry so much as focused, as though it had simply decided I was now a thing that needed to be removed from its path. I screamed so loud it hurt my own ears, but the bear didn't even flinch. It barreled into my chest, knocking me off my feet, my back slamming into the hard earth so hard I felt the breath explode out of my lungs. 1,000 tiny stars blinked in my vision, and for an instant I forgot where I was. The bear's weight crushed my ribs, pinning me like a rag doll. I remember trying to scramble backward, using my elbows and heels to push myself away, but the bear stayed over me, panting, its hot breath flooding my face with the scent of meat and mud. Its saliva dripped in long, shining threads onto my cheeks, and I could feel flecks of dirt sticking to my skin. It let out a low, rolling growl that vibrated through my bones, the sound so close it felt like it came from inside my own chest. My right arm was trapped beneath its forelimb, and I could feel the press of thick muscle shifting against me every time it moved. Its claws, curved and pale, gouged at the soil on either side of my body, close enough that a single slip would have laid me open from collarbone to belly. My mouth worked helplessly, trying to speak or scream, but nothing came out but a thin rasp. Somewhere distant I could hear a raven cawing, and the absurdity of that sound in the middle of my terror almost broke my mind. I remember thinking I was seconds away from feeling its teeth sink into my throat. Instead, it lifted its head and stared at me as if weighing its options, its ears swiveling, picking up sounds I couldn't hear. And then it lowered its face and bit into my shoulder. The pain was an electric storm detonating through every nerve in my body, so sharp and total that it felt unreal, like my mind refused to accept that flesh was tearing away from bone. My scream finally tore free, high and raw, echoing into the silent trees around us. I could feel the heat of my own blood spurting over my chest and pooling beneath my back in sticky warmth that soaked through my shirt. The bear shook its head once, ripping skin and muscle as easily as wet paper, and I heard the hideous crunch of my own bones splintering. I thrashed wildly, beating at its snout with my free hand, but its fur was coarse and slick with my blood, and it barely seemed to notice my blows. I tried to punch its eyes, remembering something I'd read in a pamphlet at the ranger station, but the bear jerked its head away, leaving me swinging at empty air. My vision darkened at the edges, and black spots danced across the pine canopy overhead. I thought of my family, of my grandkids waiting for me to come home with silly souvenirs from the gift shop. For a moment I thought, this is it. This is how my story ends, in the jaws of a grizzly in Yellowstone. In a sudden burst of pure survival, I managed to claw my bear spray off my belt, the plastic canister slick with blood, my fingers slipping on the trigger. I pulled the safety off with my teeth because my left hand wouldn't work, and I jammed the nozzle straight into the bear's face, pressing down as hard as I could. The bear recoiled instantly, roaring so loud it felt like my skull would split, its eyes squeezed shut, strings of mucus hanging from its snout. A fog of bright orange spray hung in the air between us, and the bear began coughing, hacking, shaking its massive head side to side. It backed up a few steps, pouring at its eyes, and for the first time I saw terror in the creature instead of hunger. Its roar faded into chuffing, guttural sounds as it staggered sideways into the undergrowth, branches snapping under its bulk. I lay there frozen, chest heaving, unable to move, half expecting it to come charging back for the kill. But the bear kept retreating, grunting and coughing, until I could no longer see its shape among the trees. My hand was still locked around the bear spray canister, trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. My shoulder felt like it was on fire, blood pouring in a hot, rhythmic gush. The forest seemed to pour back into my ears all at once. Birds crying, wind in the branches, the far-off hiss of thermal vents releasing steam. My face was slick with tears and sweat, the taste of copper thick on my tongue. I tried to sit up, but a bolt of pain shot from my shoulder into my spine, and I screamed again, the sound echoing off the trees like an animal caught in a trap. I forced myself to roll onto my side, pressing my good arm against the wound to slow the bleeding, gasping through clenched teeth. Pine needles stuck to my skin, and the smell of bear spray hung sharp and chemical around me, making my eyes water. The world tilted and spun, shadows weaving together as the adrenaline drained out of my veins. Somewhere behind me I heard a rustling, and I thought for one blind moment the bear had come back. But it was only the wind shivering the undergrowth. I lay there trembling, staring up at the endless sky, realizing I was still alive, though I didn't know how long that would last. And as the pain roared back in waves, I closed my eyes, drifting toward darkness. When I woke up, everything felt far away, like I was looking at my own body through the wrong end of a telescope. Fluorescent lights glared overhead, so bright they made my eyes water, and every surface smelled of antiseptic and plastic. I was in a hospital bed with crisp white sheets tucked tight around me, my right arm wrapped in thick layers of gauze and bandages, stained faint pink, where blood kept seeping through. Machines beeped steadily beside my head, measuring the frantic rhythm of my heart, as though it might still bolt out of my chest at any moment. A nurse hovered near the door, speaking in a low voice into a headset, glancing over at me like I was something fragile that might shatter if touched. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, and all that came out was a thin croak. When I finally found words, I asked about the bear first, whether it was still out there, whether they'd gone after it. The nurse squeezed my hand and told me I was safe now, but the tremor in her voice made me doubt it. Pain pulsed through my shoulder like a drumbeat, and the memory of claws and teeth replayed behind my eyelids. Even surrounded by walls and machines, I felt as exposed as I'd been in the woods. Over the next days, doctors and park officials came and went, each wearing the same strained expression as they explained how lucky I was to have survived at all. I learned I'd lost so much blood that by the time rescuers reached me, I was barely conscious, mumbling nonsense about ravens and pine trees. My shoulder had been torn open so badly they'd needed hours of surgery to repair tendons, muscles, and shattered bone fragments. They told me there was nerve damage and that my right arm might never regain full strength or sensation again. Each time they peeled back the bandages to inspect the wound, I had to look away, because the sight of my own flesh stitched together in brutal red lines made me feel faint. The smell of blood and disinfectant clung to my skin, no matter how many times they cleaned me. I had tubes in my veins, machines monitoring everything from oxygen to heart rhythm, all of it making me feel less like a man and more like a wounded animal under observation. The doctors kept saying the word miracle, but it felt hollow, because all I could think about was the bear's eyes looking into mine. Nights were the worst, when the lights dimmed and the halls went silent, except for the occasional squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. I'd close my eyes and see the bear lunging out of the shadows, feel its weight pinning me to the ground, its breath pouring hot across my face. Every rustle of sheets became the sound of claws scraping soil. Every creak of the bed frame, a branch breaking in the undergrowth. Sleep came only in jagged fragments, always ending with me gasping awake, my heart racing like I'd just run for miles. Sometimes I'd reach for my hiking poles beside the bed, only to remember they were gone, snapped in half somewhere in the forest. A counselor came to talk to me about trauma, gently suggesting ways to reframe the experience. But all I could think was how close I'd come to dying. I tried not to cry in front of him, ashamed of how small and helpless I felt, a grown man unable to stop trembling at shadows. And yet, a small voice inside me kept whispering that the bear could still be out there, searching for the thing it didn't finish. As I lay in that bed, I couldn't stop wondering why the bear had spared me. It could have crushed my skull in a single bite, torn out my throat, or dragged me deeper into the trees. Instead, it attacked and then left me bleeding, as if something had interrupted its purpose. Maybe the spray was enough, maybe it was just confused, or maybe, in its ancient mind, it decided I wasn't worth finishing off. The thought haunted me in ways I can't explain. It felt personal somehow, like the bear and I had shared a moment in which life and death balanced on the knife edge of instinct. Sometimes I pictured it still moving through the forest, wearing streaks of orange spray on its fur, blinking through watering eyes as it remembered the taste of my blood. I began to feel certain it was out there somewhere, circling the fringes of my dreams, as though a bond had been forged between predator and prey that neither of us could ever break. And the question kept pounding in my chest: why did it let me live? One afternoon, a ranger visited me with a box of items collected from the trail. Inside were my shredded shirt, my crushed metal water bottle, and the mangled remains of my hiking poles. He told me that people wanted to interview me, that my story was already making news headlines. I stared at the twisted poles and felt something inside me buckle, as if seeing them made the attack real in a way my nightmares couldn't. The ranger spoke gently about how Yellowstone belonged to the animals first, how bears didn't hunt people, how it had all been a terrible, tragic accident. I listened, but part of me was still in that clearing, the taste of bear spray in my mouth, the roar echoing through my skull. Before he left, he placed my battered leather journal on the table beside my bed. Pages were stained with blood, some torn, but it was still there. I opened it and found the last line I'd written before the attack. "This place feels like it's holding its breath." I closed the journal, pressed it to my chest, and in that moment, I decided that if I was going to survive, I'd have to find meaning in the scars the bear left behind. The months that followed were a blur of physical therapy and endless appointments, each one measuring how much motion I'd regained in my right arm, how much feeling was coming back to my fingertips. My shoulder ached constantly, a deep, grinding throb that no pills seemed to silence completely. My scars were like a roadmap of that day, jagged and raised, running down my chest and across my upper arm in cruel red lines. At first, I hid them beneath long sleeves and loose shirts, ashamed of how monstrous I thought they looked. People stared sometimes when they caught a glimpse, their eyes full of a mixture of pity and horror. But over time, I began to see those scars differently, not as evidence of weakness, but as proof that I'd been to the edge of death and clawed my way back. I started hiking short trails again, testing my limits under the wary watch of my therapists. Each time the wind rustled the leaves, my pulse spiked, convinced for a heartbeat that claws were coming for me again. Yet step by step, I refused to surrender my life to fear. My family grew closer around me in ways I'd never expected. My grandkids visiting me with cards they'd drawn of me as a superhero fighting off a giant cartoon bear. My daughter would sit beside me, holding my hand while I struggled through therapy exercises, telling me that my survival was a miracle that none of them took for granted. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years began calling or sending letters, sharing their own brushes with death, their own scars both visible and hidden. I felt my world expand and shrink at the same time. So many new connections formed, but all revolving around the single moment when teeth and claws met flesh. My wife would sometimes wake me from nightmares, wiping the sweat from my forehead, whispering that it was over, that I was safe. And though I wanted to believe her, there were still nights when I'd lie awake, hearing the bear's breath, smelling that musky, feral scent, as if it hung in my bedroom air. But the difference now was that I wasn't facing it alone. One crisp fall morning, I found myself back in Yellowstone, standing at the edge of the same trail where it had all happened. The park rangers had escorted me, nervous about me returning, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. The forest looked unchanged, pines swaying gently in the breeze, sunlight scattering like coins through the branches, birds flitting from tree to tree. But to me, it felt like holy ground, a place where I'd been stripped to my core and rebuilt from the inside out. I closed my eyes and listened to the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of a thermal vent, the delicate scratching of tiny claws in the underbrush. For a moment, I felt certain that the bear was nearby, watching me just as it had that morning. I whispered into the silence that I wasn't angry, that I understood it had only followed its nature. A strange peace settled over me, fragile but real. I opened my eyes, expecting the world to look smaller after everything I'd been through. Instead, it seemed impossibly vast. I made a decision that day to speak publicly about what had happened, not for attention, but because I wanted people to understand that wilderness wasn't an enemy. It was wild, and we stepped into its territory at our own risk. I started giving talks at ranger stations and wildlife safety events, showing my scars, telling my story. People cried sometimes or stayed afterward to share their own stories of fear, pain, and survival. I began writing in my journal again, filling page after page with thoughts about life, about what it means to be alive when death has already brushed past you. I found myself becoming an advocate for bear conservation, surprising even myself. I didn't blame the bear anymore. It was an animal following instincts older than human memory, and though part of me still flinched at sudden noises or unexpected shadows, I knew I'd been given a second chance. And I wanted it to mean something. A year later, I stood in my backyard, the journal in my hand, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. My shoulder throbbed in the cool evening air, a reminder of how fragile this body truly is. But I felt a strength inside me that I'd never known existed before the bear came crashing into my world. I thought about how close I'd come to dying, and somehow I'd been pulled back. I realized that the bear didn't just leave wounds on my body, it carved new pathways through my soul. I'd faced the raw force of nature, survived it, and learned that fear and wonder often live side by side. I looked up at the stars flickering into view and felt gratitude pulse through me like a heartbeat. And I whispered the truth I'd finally come to accept. That day, the wilderness didn't just leave a scar on my body, it carved a truth into my soul.